Thus, when God flooded Noah's generation, putting them all to death, he wasn't murdering innocent children, but rather children already guilty of sinning in Adam. So let's get back to the original question. Where did Adam's children eventually find husbands and wives? Was incest involved? As already stated, even prior to Adam, the world already contained humanoids. Adam was the first man only in the sense of being the first humanoid whose soul was stamped with a conscience. After his fall into sin, God began mating some of his sin-stained soul to the embryos of other humanoids, whereby they too finally became real men and women, just like Adam and Eve. These men and women became a source of husbands and wives for Adam's sons and daughters, with the result that no incest actually took place. Although I probably won't take time to address every criticism of the Bible advanced by Thunderfoot, I'll try to cover some more of the issues. Thunderfoot finds it barbaric that God would take pleasure in the smoke of animal sacrifices and the sprinkling of their blood upon the people. Actually, Scripture tells us explicitly that God takes no pleasure in these things. Allow me to explain. Fellowship between two parties, such as man and God, is possible only to the extent of physical sensations. Although God does not like rituals, ceremonies, and sacrifices, he certainly does like fellowship and obedience. In other words, he institutes a ceremony only with the following intent. If the people are walking in obedience, he crowns their ceremony with an outpouring of his own tangible presence for the sake of fellowship. He begins replacing the elements of the ceremony with his own substance. As a result, the smoke of the animal sacrifices was actually the divine pillar of smoke and cloud, which in God's nostrils had a very pleasant odor. In other words, it was Christ that God the Father was smelling, not the smoke of burning flesh. God is quite clear that he did not like the sacrifices as such. And when Moses sprinkled blood upon the people, it was actually Christ's own substance in liquid form, and therefore it was Christ's own blood that was sprinkled. For it is by the sprinkling of Christ's shed blood upon our bodies, says the book of Hebrews, that our bodies and souls are physically washed of sin. In the Gospels, where Christ spoke of eating his flesh and drinking his blood, which actually happened at the Last Supper, he was referring to his divine liquids and solids, not to his human flesh and blood. But why would God want us to eat his own substance? Again, fellowship between two parties exists only to the extent of physical sensations. In order to maximize fellowship between God and man, we must eat him, taste him, see him, hear him, touch him, and smell him. We'll be doing this for all eternity. Thunderfoot claims that the Bible is clearly fiction because it calls us to believe in witches, warlocks, and demons. First of all, even atheists believe in witches because anyone who practices witchcraft is properly called a witch by definition. And I agree with atheists that loudly chanting spells and incantations is powerless in itself because there's no such thing as magic. The only existing power, in my opinion, is self-propulsion. What about gravity? Isn't gravity a kind of power? Isaac Newton invented the theory of gravity, but admitted it was a silly concept because it would be silly to postulate an invisible force that magically pushes or pulls us from a distance, and thus without any direct physical contact. Although I definitely do not believe in gravity because I certainly don't believe in magic. I most certainly do believe in self-propelling angels, including fallen angels called demons. And a witch would have power only if God allowed demons to do her bidding. But the fact that witches don't do anything impressive these days indicates that he generally does not allow demons to do the bidding of witches. Thunderfoot also complains that the Bible commands us to stone witches and warlocks to death. Actually, the Bible wasn't even written to me and therefore doesn't command me to do anything at all. My only moral obligation, as already stated, is to act in accordance with the feelings of certainty present within my conscience. A person who is 100% certain that he's morally obligated to stone a witch is in fact obligated to do so. But God has never given me such a strong feeling of certainty. Therefore, I can see no justification for stoning a witch. Even if I felt 90% certain that I should stone a witch, I still wouldn't do it because I would certainly feel about 95% certain that the 90% certainty is insufficient to warrant murder. In other words, the higher degree of certainty always trumps the lower degree of certainty in a rational system of ethics. Although God did indeed impart to Moses' generation a feeling of certainty about stoning witches, most later generations of Israelites did not have this feeling. After all, God had blessed Moses' generation with an abundant outpouring of heavenly grace. He showed himself visibly, he healed their bodies, he displayed signs and wonders, he destroyed their enemies, and he gave their hearts strength to resist the temptation to sin. Such an abundant outpouring of grace is called revival. During a revival, God becomes somewhat intolerant of sin, and that's why he commanded Israel to stone people to death, even for seemingly minor transgressions. That's why witches were stoned to death at that time. But later generations were typically too disobedient to receive revival, and therefore did not, generally speaking, receive from God a feeling of certainty obligating them to stone witches. So there's no reason to do that today. By the way, why does God allow animals to suffer? If they were innocent, he probably would not allow them to suffer because he is just. But how then can animals be guilty? There's only one possible solution to this problem. The souls of animals are fallen angels. This is not to say that an animal is evil. An animal's brain doesn't foster moral choice to a degree classifiable as good or evil. Therefore, an animal is morally neutral. Nonetheless, the souls of animals were probably guilty of sin long before God placed these souls within the bodies of animals. Gravity holds the stars in place. For the first 1,500 years of church history, up to the Renaissance, all Bible scholars, both Jewish and Christian, recognized that the literal reading of Genesis 1 envisions a solid firmament in which God anchors the stars, holding them in place. I submit that the firmament is God's own tangible presence. To put it differently, gravity is probably nothing more than God's tangible presence, what Moses called the firmament, exerting itself upon all inert particles as to keep the stars in place and preserve our world order. I'm not really mentioning this suggestion as a gap theory, although it's true that scientists admit that they still can't figure out what gravity is or what causes it. I'm merely illustrating that much of the Bible can be taken literally without abandoning scientific principles such as gravity. One reason for the rise and spread of atheism is that all the traditional definitions of God are either unintelligible or self-contradictory. Please allow me briefly to develop a portrait of God that is logically consistent. Recently, a number of evangelical theologians have admitted that he doesn't know the future. This doctrine is called open theism and is quite correct, for two reasons. First of all, to say that God has free will means that he deliberates over a decision and therefore does not already foreknow the outcome of that decision. Secondly, a kind-hearted God would not create people foreknown to sin such as Adam, Eve, and Lucifer. Instead, he would only create those people foreknown to abstain from sin, such as the holy angels of today. The fact that he created individuals who sinned, therefore, implies that he lacks foreknowledge. Furthermore, we cannot define God as a being who is inherently holy and omniscient by nature, for such a being would have no free will to choose evil and therefore would merit no praise. A person merits praise only for what he has accomplished over time at the expense of labor and suffering. He does not merit any praise for that which he is by nature. In fact, the Incarnation proves that he is not holy and omniscient by nature, for he appeared on earth as an ignorant infant expected to learn Hebrew and capable of suffering temptation in the wilderness for 40 days. On the other hand, he must be immutably holy in some sense, for his promises to us are worthless if he still has enough free will to choose evil any time he wants. We must therefore conclude that at some point in time God managed to institute within himself a mechanism reducing his freedom of choice to the extent that he no longer has the option to choose evil. This implementation probably had two stages. In the first stage, eons of freely choosing to walk in righteousness instilled within God a compelling habit of holiness, an addiction to holiness so absolute that he cannot become unholy overnight. It would literally take ages of time for him to slowly reverse his holiness. And this is where stage 2 comes in. He must have instituted within himself an immune system whereby he cannot regress to unholiness even slowly. It works like this. The immune system is part of God's own substance, an intelligent lifeblood that continually monitors his being for germs. Recall that Jesus wanted us to eat his flesh and drink his blood. But the type of germ sought out is moral rather than biological. In other words, the immune system remains on the lookout for even the slightest decline in holy zeal in any of the particles of the divine substance. Upon finding such a germ, the immune system targets it with a revival, that is, a revitalizing outpouring of divine grace. God cannot deactivate his immune system because his addiction to it can only be reversed so slowly that the immune system itself will have plenty of time to counteract the effort. And the immune system won't deactivate itself due to the same kind of addiction to its work. That is to say, if a decline in zeal began to germinate in one of the particles constituting the immune system, the remainder of the immune system would instantly nip it in the bud. The immune system as a whole is so addicted to its work that there is no chance of a united effort at mutiny. To summarize, the job of the immune system is to preserve the Godhead. For instance, it generally will not allow a member of the Trinity to lose its knowledge, skill, and moral purity. However, the immune system is fully intelligent and therefore permitted the Son, as an exception to this rule, to become weak, ignorant, and capable of suffering temptation for the sake of the Incarnation on earth. God the Father made the Son ignorant by physically scrambling his currents of thought. By the way, the term Trinity simply refers to the fact that God, by free choice, has subdivided his own being into 3 sections. Each section is a self-propelling person. Seated on one throne is a human-shaped figure named the Father. Seated at his right hand is a human-shaped figure named the Son. The remainder of his substance, for instance the river of fire flowing from the throne, is called the Holy Spirit. That's why the disciples saw tongues of fire falling on their heads on Pentecost. Man is made in God's image in the literal sense of a human body shaped like the 2 figures seated on their thrones. When God created us, he could have restricted our freedom just enough to prevent sin. So isn't it needlessly cruel that he gave us so much freedom? And did not his own Son end up dying on a cross because of this needlessly cruel decision? Yes, it is indeed needlessly cruel, unless he actually had a need for us. I submit that he needed us in the following way. At the outset, he had to decide whether to undertake this enormously difficult task of slowly becoming perfect in holiness, knowledge, and skill. Had he failed to make this commitment, reality as a whole would forever be a dangerous place to live. But so intimidating and daunting and overwhelming was his project that he couldn't bring himself to commit to it without first promising himself a reward at the end of the tunnel. His reward is a church that has made at least a minimum number of freely willed decisions to love and obey him. In fact, this world won't end until at least the minimum number of freely willed decisions has been fulfilled. And that's pretty much the end of the lecture. If you're a Christian interested in hearing my views on evangelism, missionary work, church government, and sanctification, please listen to my audio lectures named after my mentor, Andrew Murray, which are available on my website, www.bibleversesearchengines.com. You have to put hyphens between those words. It's www.bibleversesearchengines.com. Again, the materials presented on that website is a series of lectures on the theology of Andrew Murray. Today is Monday, October 26th, 2009. I thank you for your time and attention.